So besides the guide plate and the presser foot, we've also got our needle here. So the needle is basically just a really thin, sharp piece of metal that is going up and down and doing quite a lot of the work. This is probably one of the most important maintenance parts of the machines. It's one of the easiest things that you can take care of, but probably one of the things that most people don't take care of. So the sewing machine needle is supposed to have a lifespan of about 6 to 8 hours of stitching time. So not from when you put it on your machine, but from actually going up and down through fabric. And that can be sometimes a little bit tricky to measure. A lot of people will do, every major project or depending on how often they're using their machine. But you do want to be mindful of the needle because it is, I would say, definitely one of those things that every stitch that it's taking, it's getting more dull and it's also getting less straight. And so over time, it is just going to stop hitting the plate or stop sort of connecting in the way that it's meant to connect inside the machine. And so as it starts to be dull or not straight, it can potentially start to hit something that it's not supposed to hit inside the machine. And then I ultimately just stop stitching. So I've definitely recommend there are really just a few troubleshooting things that I usually try to run through if I am having trouble on my machine. And so changing out the needle is definitely one of them. You can actually even hear when your needle needs to be changed. And so I've definitely have a few months ago, I borrowed my mom's sewing machine and I brought it to a class and we were using it. And I remember that when I took it from her, she was like, I don't know the last time I changed the needle as I was walking out the door with her machine. And I was like, oh, and then I forgot. And then I set the machine up in the class. And then I think I was doing a little demo on it. And I was like, as soon as I started to sew, I could just hear this little clicking noise. And it was basically the needle was so dull that didn't have a point anymore. And it was like puncturing through, it wasn't sliding through the fabric anymore. It was kind of like puncturing it. And so you hear this constant clicking noise. And so if you can hear your needle going through your fabric, it probably needs to be changed. So you definitely shouldn't hear it sort of going through the fabric. It should just be, that should be a quiet thing. So definitely that's a really easy, quick fix. There are a bunch of different kinds of sewing machine needles as well. And so if you're using a very specific type of fabric, you want to pair the needle with the fabric that you're using. Some of those kinds of needles might be a needle for knit fabrics or denim if you're using something really heavy duty. There are needles for silk and there are needles for if you're using a metallic thread even. So there's definitely a lot of needles that you can pair. For the most part, I'm sewing with a universal needle. That's kind of like a good all-purpose needle for most regular sewing. I just mostly am doing clothing and I sew mostly with cotton and linen. And so that is a needle that works well for me. There are different sizes of needle. And so that's just referring to how thick the shaft is on the needle. So for the most part, I would say I've usually got a size 80 or a size 90 on my machine. And those are just sort of good all-purpose sizes for most things. The higher that number goes, 100, 110, 120, those are heavier, thicker needles. And so those would be good for denim or canvas or things like that. And then the skinnier needles, like a 70 or 60, are for finer fabrics. So an interesting thing to note as well about the needle sizes is then not only does the thickness of the shaft or the needle go up. So if you're using a heavier needle, the size of the hole in the needle also gets bigger. So you get a bigger eye because oftentimes for those thicker fabrics, oftentimes people will also use a thicker thread. And so those two things simultaneously grow, but they also simultaneously shrink. So if you're going to a skinnier, a finer needle, the hole is also getting finer. And so that is just maybe something that some people don't realize because it means that you can't actually use you have to also use a finer thread. So if you were using a really fine needle for really fine silk, you would also want to make sure that you were using a really fine thread as well, because your regular thread may not be quite as fine as the whole of the needle that you're paired with. So those are a couple of things that can definitely cause some weird things to happen. If you are trying to use a thicker thread through a finer needle with a finer hole, you may encounter some weird things happening as well. So definitely needle is one of those sort of troubleshooting things that if you're having issues, the needle is one of the things that I always either check or replace depending on what's happening on your machine. So that is our needle.